When my daughter married into a family I barely knew, I kept one secret from everyone at that wedding. The $42 million settlement my late husband left me was still sitting untouched, hidden behind the ordinary life of a retired shop teacher. Staying quiet about that money turned out to be the wisest thing I ever did in 68 years on this earth. Because 11 days after I watched my daughter say "I do," her new husband walked into my kitchen holding a folder that was about to turn my whole world upside down. They assumed a widower who drove a 20-year-old Ford and fixed his own gutters had nothing worth protecting. That assumption was about to cost them everything. If you have ever been underestimated by your own family, tell me what state you're watching from, and stay with me, because you will not believe how far these two were willing to go. My name is Walter Prescott. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I taught woodworking and metal shop at the same high school in Millbrook, Ohio, before I hung up my apron for good. My late wife, Carol, passed 6 years ago from a cancer that took her fast and cruel, but not before a wrongful death settlement from the hospital that missed the warning signs came through $42 million, wired quietly into a trust that only I could touch. I never moved into a bigger house. I never bought a new truck. I kept driving my old Ford, kept clipping coupons at the Kroger, kept living exactly the way I had before any of it happened. Because Carol used to say that money changes people faster than anything else on God's earth, and I wanted to see who my daughter really was before that money ever entered the picture. My daughter's name is Ashley. She's 29, works as a dental hygienist, and 11 days before this story starts, I stood in a rented barn outside of town and watched her marry a man named Derek Manning. Derek was 34, worked in what he called commercial logistics consulting, drove a leased BMW he was always careful to mention was just temporary until the Tesla comes in, and had a way of shaking my hand a little too firmly, like he was trying to prove something to himself more than to me. His mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Patrice, had cornered me at the reception and asked, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, whether I'd ever thought about getting into something more comfortable than my little 3-bedroom rambler on Cedar Street. I told her I was plenty comfortable. She didn't believe me. I could see it in the way her eyes swept over my off-the-rack suit. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 11 days after the wedding, and I was out in my garage sanding down an old rocking chair I'd been restoring for the church rummage sale. The radio was playing low, the smell of sawdust and lemon oil filling the air the way it always did, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Then I heard tires on my gravel driveway, fast and aggressive, the kind of stop that throws small rocks against a fender. I stepped out from the garage and saw Derek's leased BMW parked at an angle behind my truck, like he hadn't bothered to straighten it out. He got out first. Behind him, from the passenger seat, stepped a woman I'd never laid eyes on in my life, mid-40s. Sharp black blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, sunglasses pushed up into hair that looked like it cost more than my monthly pension check. "Mr. Prescott," Derek said. Not even a hello, not even a glance toward Ashley, who was nowhere in sight. "This is Renata Voss. She handles guardianship filings for the county. We need to talk." I set down my sanding block and wiped my hands on my apron. "Guardianship filings," I repeated. "Derek, what in God's name are you talking about? Where's Ashley?" "Ashley's with her mother-in-law," he said, which struck me as strange since Carol had been dead 6 years and I had no idea who he meant until I realized he meant Patrice Ashley was apparently spending her Saturday with Patrice instead of coming to see her own father. She didn't want to be here for this part. It's hard for her. Renata Voss stepped forward without waiting for an invitation, opened her leather portfolio right there on my driveway, and pulled out a thick, stapled document. "Mr. Prescott, I'm filing an emergency petition for temporary guardianship on behalf of your daughter, based on documented concerns about your cognitive capacity to manage your own affairs. This includes a freeze on any accounts, properties, or assets currently under your control, pending a court-ordered evaluation." I stood there in my sawdust-covered apron, 68 years old, feeling the ground genuinely tilt beneath my boots. "My cognitive capacity," I said slowly. "I built that rocking chair from a busted-up frame I found at an estate sale 2 weeks ago. I balance my own checkbook. I drove myself to a dentist appointment yesterday. What exactly are you claiming is wrong with me?" Derek had the decency, or maybe the cowardice, to look at the ground instead of at me. "Walter, the neighbors have noticed things. You've been talking to yourself. Mrs. Higgins next door said she saw you standing in your yard at 2 in the morning last week, just staring at nothing. That was true. Actually, I had been out at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep and I'd gone out to look at the stars the way Carol and I used to, back when we were young and broke and happy. But hearing it repeated back to me through Derek's mouth, twisted into evidence of some kind of decline, made my stomach turn. I was looking at the sky, I said. Carol loved the stars. See, that's exactly the kind of thing we're worried about, Derek said. And there was something in his voice now, something rehearsed, like a man reading lines he'd practiced in a mirror. You talk about Carol like she's still around sometimes. It's not healthy, Walter. Ashley's scared for you. Renata handed me the stapled petition. My hands, steady enough to sand a chair leg to a perfect curve an hour earlier, were shaking now as I flipped through the pages. There, near the back, was a section labeled Supporting Documentation, and beneath it, a photocopy of what appeared to be a letter from a doctor, Whitmore, a name I did not recognize, describing a series of appointments I had never attended, diagnosing early-stage cognitive impairment I had never been told about, recommending immediate oversight of my financial and legal affairs. I've never heard of a Dr. Whitmore in my life, I said. He's affiliated with the Grantham Senior Wellness Center, Renata said smoothly, as if reciting a script. Your daughter arranged the evaluations after noticing the changes. You may not remember the visits clearly. That's actually consistent with the diagnosis. I looked from the paper to Derek, and something cold and clear settled into my chest, cutting straight through the panic. 40 years in a shop classroom teaches you to recognize when a joint doesn't sit right, when a weld is hiding a crack underneath a clean coat of paint. This didn't sit right, not even close. You have until Friday morning, Renata continued, to comply with the temporary restrictions. Any attempt to move funds, sell property, or contact financial institutions during this period will be treated as a violation of the emergency order and could result in a bench warrant. Derek finally looked up and met my eyes, and for just a flicker of a second, I saw something underneath the rehearsed concern, something closer to triumph. It's for your own good, Walter. Once the evaluation clears you, everything goes back to normal. We're just trying to protect you. They left me standing in my own driveway holding a stack of paper built entirely out of lies, the BMW's tires kicking up gravel again as it pulled away. I stood there for a long moment, the Saturday morning sun beating down on my shoulders, and I felt something in me go very still and very quiet. The same stillness I used to feel right before diagnosing a failure in a machine that everyone else had already given up on. I walked back into my garage, set the papers on my workbench, and looked at them under the good light I kept over my table saw. Something about that Dr. Whitmore letterhead bothered me. The font was wrong, too modern, too clean for what claimed to be a decade-old medical practice. I picked up the phone and called Ashley. She answered on the second ring, and her voice had none of the fear or worry Derek had described. It was flat, practiced. Dad, I know Derek talked to you. I think it's really the right move, honestly. Ashley, I have never once been to a doctor named Whitmore. I don't have cognitive impairment. I fixed the transmission on my truck 3 weeks ago. For God's sake. Dad, please don't get defensive, she said. And there was that same rehearsed cadence Derek had used, like they'd sat down together and written out a script beforehand. This is exactly the kind of denial the specialist said to expect. Remember the thing with the stove last month? I froze. The stove. 2 weeks before the wedding, Derek had come by to help me prep for hosting the rehearsal dinner, insisting on cooking a pot of chili himself while sending me out to the shed to find an old cast-iron skillet he claimed he needed. I'd spent almost 20 minutes out there, and when I came back in, the burner had been cranked to high, the chili boiled black and smoking, the fire alarm shrieking, Derek nowhere in sight until he burst back through the front door moments later, breathless, claiming he'd stepped out to take an urgent call and hadn't realized the stove was still on. I remembered apologizing to him. I remembered feeling foolish. Standing in my garage now, holding a forged medical letter, the memory rearranged itself into something else entirely. Not an accident, but a seed, planted deliberately, watered with just enough doubt to grow into exactly what they needed. Ashley, I said quietly, I did not leave that stove on. Derek did. Dad, please. Her voice cracked, just slightly, and for one moment I thought I heard my real daughter underneath the script. Mom would want you taken care of. That's all this is. Hearing Carol's name used as a weapon against me did something no forged document ever could. It confirmed, beyond any doubt, that whoever had written that script for my daughter to read had studied exactly which buttons to press. "Okay," I said, letting my voice go soft, defeated, exactly the way they wanted to hear it. "Okay, honey. I'll cooperate. I just need some time to understand all this. That's all we're asking," she said, relief flooding her voice, and she hung up without another word. I set the phone down and stood very still in the quiet of my garage, the smell of sawdust still hanging in the air, and I made a decision. I was not going to fight them with outrage. Outrage was exactly what they expected from a frightened old man clinging to his independence, and outrage would only feed the narrative of decline they were building brick by brick. If they wanted to treat me like a fragile old fool, I would give them the most convincing performance of my life, right up until the moment I didn't need to anymore. I spent that evening doing what I'd always done best, taking a broken system apart piece by piece to find exactly where the failure began. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down every detail I could remember. The stove incident. The strange, formal way Derek had started calling me Walter instead of Mr. Prescott right after the engagement, testing out a familiarity he hadn't earned. The way Patrice had asked at the wedding whether I had made arrangements for my estate, phrased so casually I'd almost missed the calculation behind it. Derek's leased BMW, his vague talk of commercial logistics consulting that never seemed to involve an actual office or actual coworkers I could name. None of it, on its own, meant much. Together, laid out on paper the way I used to diagram a faulty circuit, it painted a very different picture than the doting new son-in-law Derek pretended to be. The next morning, I drove to the Millbrook branch of my credit union, the one Derek and Ashley knew about, the account holding roughly $31,000 of my pension and Social Security, the account I'd deliberately kept modest for exactly this kind of moment. I asked the teller, a young woman named Priya who'd known me for years, to print out the last 3 months of statements. There it was, buried among grocery charges and the electric bill. A wire transfer of $28,000, processed 4 days ago, routed to an account under the name Manning Consolidated Holdings LLC, with a memo line that read, simply, Family Care Transition Fund. I hadn't authorized that transfer. I hadn't even known it was possible without my signature. I asked Priya how it had gone through, and she pulled up the file, her brow furrowing. "There's a power of attorney on file, Mr. Prescott. Filed about 2 weeks ago. Your signature's right here." She turned the screen toward me, and there it was. My name, my handwriting, or something close enough to fool a bank teller who saw 400 signatures a week. I did not sign that document. I know exactly where I was 2 weeks ago, because I still had the receipt in my wallet. I'd spent that entire week at a cabin up near Presque Isle, with 3 old buddies from my Army Reserve unit, a trip we'd taken every October for the past 11 years, completely off the grid, no cell service for 4 straight days, 14 witnesses, who could place me 200 miles from Millbrook, on the exact date this power of attorney claimed. I'd signed it in front of a notary downtown. I thanked Priya, drove home and sat in my driveway for a long moment before going inside, letting the full shape of what was happening settle over me. This wasn't just about controlling my finances anymore. This was fraud, forged and filed with a forged medical diagnosis behind it, and forged documents mean somebody was desperate enough to risk prison. Desperate people don't manufacture guardianship petitions over pocket change. They do it when the walls are closing in fast, and they need a much bigger number than $28,000 to make the walls stop closing. I had one advantage. Neither Derek nor Ashley knew existed. 6 years ago, when the settlement first came through, Carol's attorney had introduced me to a woman named Diane Kowalski, a financial and forensic strategist who managed the trust with the kind of discretion that comes from decades of handling money that people didn't want the world to know about. Diane knew the real number. Diane knew everything. That night, I went down to my basement, past the workbench, to a locked steel cabinet I'd installed myself back when the settlement first came through, the kind of thing you build when you've spent your whole life believing that quiet, careful men survive longer than loud, careless ones. Inside was a satellite phone Diane had given me years ago, along with instructions to use it only if something happened that made me distrust the ordinary channels. I powered it on and dialed her number from memory. "Walter," she said, picking up on the second ring despite the late hour. "This isn't a social call, Diane. I need a full financial and legal audit on my son-in-law, Derek Manning, and his mother, Patrice Manning. Every debt, every account, Every business filing, going back 5 years. Somebody forged my signature on a power of attorney and used it to file a fraudulent guardianship petition against me, backed by a fake medical diagnosis. They already pulled $28,000 out of my public account. There was a pause, then the sound of Diane's voice sharpening into something all business. Walter, that's felony forgery and elder financial abuse, layered together. I can have a fraud attorney filing a countersuit by Monday morning. Not yet, I said. If we come in loud right now, they'll panic, destroy whatever paper trail exists, and I'll never find out what's actually driving this. I want to know exactly what kind of hole they're standing in before I decide how deep to bury them. Give me 24 hours. Understood, she said, and I could hear her already typing. I'll have preliminary findings by tomorrow night. Anything else? One more thing, I said. Do not touch the guardianship filing yet. Do not freeze anything. I want them to believe they're winning. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my basement for a long time, the hum of the furnace the only sound in the house, feeling the same strange, focused calm. I used to feel standing over a machine everyone else had already written off as broken beyond repair. The next day I played my part exactly as they'd scripted it. I called Ashley and told her, voice trembling just enough, that I'd agreed to see whatever doctor they wanted, that I was scared and confused, and just wanted things to go back to normal. She sounded almost giddy with relief, which told me more than any forged document ever could. This wasn't a daughter reluctantly going along with a manipulative husband. This was a daughter who wanted this to work. That evening, I drove across town to the townhouse Derek and Ashley had moved into after the wedding, a rental that was well beyond what a logistics consultant should be able to afford on his own. I brought along a box of Carol's old canning jars, telling Ashley over the phone that I wanted her to have them before I couldn't remember where I'd put them. It was a flimsy excuse, but grief makes excellent camouflage, and Ashley let me in without a second thought, too distracted by an incoming call on her cell phone to watch me closely as I set the box down in the hallway. While she paced near the kitchen window arguing quietly with someone on the phone about a payment window, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small, flat listening device, no bigger than a stick of gum, purchased years ago for a different purpose, entirely recording engine diagnostics during long test drives. Back when I still consulted part-time for a local auto shop, I pressed the adhesive backing against the underside of the coffee table in their living room, the kind of place nobody thinks to check, and slipped back into the hallway just as Ashley ended her call. Sorry, Dad, she said, rubbing her temples. Work stuff. It's all right, sweetheart, I said, letting my voice waver just enough. I should get going. I'm tired. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, my heart pounding with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite triumph, just the cold clarity of a man finally doing something instead of waiting to be destroyed. 2 nights later, the small receiver I kept in my study crackled to life. I sat down with a cup of black coffee and a pair of old headphones, and I listened as my daughter's marriage revealed itself for exactly what it was. You told me this would be clean. Ashley's voice came through, tight and frightened in a way I'd never heard from her before. You said once Renata filed the petition, we'd have full control of his accounts within a week. It's been 11 days, Derek, and all we've got is 28 grand from his little checking account. That's not going to cover what you owe. I know what it's not going to cover, Derek snapped back, his voice stripped of all the warmth he'd shown me. You think I don't know that? Renata says the full guardianship hearing isn't until next month. We don't have a month, Ashley. We have maybe 2 weeks before Cordero sends somebody to my mother's house. I gripped my mug so tight my knuckles went white. Cordero. A name, finally. Something solid to hand to Diane. How much do you actually owe him? Ashley asked, and her voice had gone very small. There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of ice against glass, before Derek spoke again. 1.8 million. I sat frozen in my study chair. $1.8 million. Not the debt of a struggling consultant who'd overextended himself on a leased BMW. That was the debt of a man who'd gambled catastrophically on something far more dangerous than bad investments. How, Ashley whispered, does a logistics consultant owe somebody named Cordero $1.8 million? It doesn't matter how, Derek said sharply. What matters is your father has $42 million sitting in a trust, and dental hygienists don't marry into that kind of secrecy by accident, Ashley. I did my research before I ever proposed to you. Your dad's been sandbagging that fortune for 6 years pretending to be broke. We just need guardianship, and every dollar in that trust becomes accessible to manage on his behalf. That's not theft. That's just paperwork. I heard Ashley's sharp intake of breath, and for one terrible second I hoped that this was the moment she'd break, the moment she'd realize the man she married had targeted her specifically because of what her father was quietly sitting on. Instead, after a long, heavy silence, she asked the only question that seemed to matter to her. And once the guardianship goes through, how fast can we actually access it? Something in my chest went cold and final in that moment. My own daughter, asking not whether this was wrong, but whether it was fast enough. Once Renata's petition clears, Derek said, "We control every account, every property, every signature. Cordero gets his money, we keep the difference. And your father spends the rest of his life in a nice, quiet, assisted facility where nobody asks him any inconvenient questions about what happened to his fortune. And if he fights it, if somebody actually checks and finds out there's no Dr. Whitmore, by the time anybody checks," Derek said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "we'll already have the money moved. Renata's handled a dozen of these. Old men don't fight back, Ashley. They get confused, they get tired, and eventually they just go along with whatever their family tells them, because deep down, they're terrified of ending up alone." I sat in my study long after the recording fell silent, the coffee gone cold in my hands, feeling the full architecture of the trap finally revealed. This wasn't a son-in-law who'd made one desperate mistake. This was a calculated hunt, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, wasn't the victim of it. She was standing right beside the hunter, checking her watch. The next morning, Diane's data came through on the satellite phone exactly as promised, and it confirmed everything the recording had already told me, with the kind of cold detail only a forensic audit can provide. Derek Manning had no consulting firm. Manning Consolidated Holdings LLC was an empty shell registered 8 months ago. Its only real activity a handful of transfers in and out, designed to look like legitimate business income. The real story was a catastrophic string of losses in an unregulated offshore trading platform, compounded by a high-interest private loan from a man named Anthony Cordero, a name that pulled up 2 prior fraud investigations and 1 unsolved assault case tied to unpaid debts. Renata Voss wasn't a county guardianship officer at all. She was a paralegal who'd lost her license 3 years earlier for falsifying court documents in a separate elder abuse case. Exactly the kind of person Derek would have needed to manufacture a convincing petition. I picked up the satellite phone and called Diane back. "I need you to do something very specific," I said. "I want you to buy Derek's debt from this Cordero directly. Full amount, $1.8 million, paid quietly, routed through a shell entity so it looks like Cordero simply sold the paper to a larger collector. I want every ounce of leverage that debt gives him. Estate. You want to become his creditor," Diane said slowly. "I want to own the rope before he finishes tying his own noose," I said. "And I want it done before the guardianship hearing. If we go to the police right now with what we have, this drags through court for a year. They hire lawyers. They cry victim. And my daughter never actually has to look at what she chose. I want her to see it. All of it. In one room, with no script left to read from." Diane didn't argue. 2 days later, she confirmed the debt had transferred cleanly, Cordero taking his money and walking away without a second thought about who now held the paper. Derek Manning owed $1.8 million, and every cent of that obligation now belonged to me. The guardianship hearing had been scheduled, thanks to Renata's forged urgency, for the following Thursday morning at the county courthouse, a date Derek had pushed hard to move up, desperate to get his hands on my accounts before Cordero's patience ran out. A patience he no longer needed to worry about, though he didn't know that yet. Thursday came in bright and cold, the kind of clean autumn morning Carol always loved. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and, for the first time in 6 years, put on the tailored navy suit I'd worn only once before, to Carol's funeral, the fabric still holding its shape despite the years in the closet. I straightened the same silver watch I'd stopped wearing when I decided to disappear into an ordinary life. And I looked at the man in the mirror, not a confused old widower anyone could push around, but exactly who I'd always been underneath the flannel and sawdust. Diane arrived at my house an hour before the hearing, dressed sharp and professional, accompanied by an attorney named Marcus Webb, a specialist in elder fraud who had already filed a countersuit that morning, quietly, without alerting Derek's side. 2 investigators from the county's Adult Protective Services Fraud Unit, alerted by Marcus through the proper channels the night before, waited outside in an unmarked car, ready to move the moment the hearing confirmed what we already knew. We walked into that courtroom together, and I watched Derek's face when he saw me, not shuffling, not confused, but standing tall in a suit that cost more than his leased BMW, flanked by a forensic financial strategist and a fraud attorney. Ashley sat beside him, and when her eyes met mine, I saw the exact moment her carefully rehearsed narrative began to crack under its own weight. "Dad," she said, her voice small in the hushed courtroom. "What is this?" "This," I said, my voice steady and carrying clearly through the room, "is the moment you find out your father isn't the confused old fool you were told he'd become." Renata Voss, called first to establish the medical basis for the guardianship petition, could not produce a single verified record for a doctor. Whitmore, because Dr. Whitmore did not exist anywhere in the state medical board's licensing database. Marcus Webb laid out, methodically, the fabricated letterhead, the forged power of attorney, and the wire transfer routed through Manning Consolidated Holdings, alongside documented proof flight and lodge records, 4 sworn statements from my Army Reserve buddies that I had been 200 miles away, entirely without cell service, on the exact date I supposedly signed that notarized document downtown. Renata's face went the color of old paper as the judge asked her to explain how she had certified a signing that provably never occurred. Then came the recording. Marcus played it through the courtroom's speaker system, and Derek's own voice filled the room, flat and cold, explaining exactly how guardianship would grant them access to every account, every property, every signature, explaining exactly how old men don't fight back, explaining exactly how a dead man's insurance and a living man's fortune had both, in his mind, simply been assets waiting to be claimed. Ashley sat frozen beside him, her hand slowly drifting away from his on the table, as she heard, for the first time in her own voice, the exact moment she'd asked how fast they could access the money, instead of whether any of it was true. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply stood when the judge asked if I had anything to add, and I looked directly at my daughter. "You asked me once," I said, "if your mother would want me taken care of. She would. She'd want me taken care of by people who loved me for who I was before there was ever a number attached to my name. You didn't marry a man who loved you, Ashley. You married a man who did the math on my silence and decided it was worth more than my life." The judge dismissed the guardianship petition in full, referred Renata Voss for prosecution on fraud and unauthorized practice of law, and ordered an immediate freeze on all of Derek's accounts pending the county's own investigation into the forged power of attorney and the illegal wire transfer. Outside the courthouse, the 2 APS investigators approached Derek directly, informing him that his outstanding $1.8 million debt, now legally owned by a holding company under my control, was being called in full, effective immediately, with formal collection proceedings to begin that same afternoon. Derek turned to me on those courthouse steps, his composure entirely gone, his voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard from the confident man who'd stood in my driveway 11 days after my daughter's wedding. "You can't do this. I'm your son-in-law. You stopped being anything to me," I said quietly. "The moment I heard you explain how fast you could get your hands on my money once I was declared too broken to stop you. I'm not taking anything you didn't already try to take from me first. I'm simply the one who happened to be paying closer attention." Ashley didn't come after me as I walked to Diane's car. She stood on those courthouse steps beside a husband whose entire fortune had just evaporated into a debt with my name quietly behind it. And something in her face told me she finally understood, far too late, exactly what she had traded her father's trust for. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, the cold autumn air moving through the car exactly the way it had the morning of Carol's funeral, and I felt, for the first time in 11 days, entirely and completely myself. The house on Cedar Street was still standing, still mine, still smelling faintly of sawdust and lemon oil, and I walked back into my garage and picked up the sanding block I'd set down the moment this all began, running it slowly over the arm of that old rocking chair, feeling the wood grow smooth and honest beneath my hands. Family is supposed to be the one place where our worth isn't measured in dollars. But greed doesn't ask permission before it moves in, and it will use the people who love us most as the doorway. I spent 6 years hiding a fortune to protect my daughter from a world that changes people the moment real money enters the room. And in the end, it wasn't the money that changed her. It was a man who saw a quiet old widower and calculated, correctly, that grief and age look exactly like weakness from the outside. He was wrong about the weakness. He just wasn't wrong soon enough to save himself. If somebody in your own family has ever underestimated exactly what you're capable of, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters to me. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay strong, because being underestimated is not the same thing as being weak. Sometimes it's simply the moment right before you prove otherwise.